Greetings from the Pacific Northwest. You're listening to Symbolic Studies Episode 3. I'm your host, Mario, joined by my lovely wife, Michelle. For more information about the show or my work, please visit symbolicstudies.com. If you'd like to become a patron, you can do so at patreon.com/symbolicstudies. Michelle, my beautiful wife, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Pretty good. It's Aries season.
It is, and it's Aries season in the air for sure. We're having a very nice spring day today, so...
I know. It feels very, very spring-like. The most spring-like day we've had so far, obviously.
Yes.
And we've had quite a bit of rain recently, so when we get these breaks, it's really a thing to just soak in and appreciate, right?
Oh, definitely. Like taking advantage of the time to go outside and just soak in the sun and do all those things when you can get it, because we aren't quite there to the point where the rainy season has exited fully. So, you know,
right.
We'll take what we can get, though.
Definitely. You know, just right off the bat, I'm reminded of the glyph of Aries looking like a sprout, right? And here we have things sprouting in the garden shed, and you've been planting seeds, and now you're prepping the garden and everything else. So you got a chance to do that today. And how was it out there?
Yeah, it was great, actually. I mean, I think like one of my roles as a gardener, I think all gardeners are probably like this, but one of the things I really love doing is like breaking ground or breaking the ground that has been grown over with grass or something like that. There's something very symbolic about it. And it definitely made me think of Aries today when I was doing that, because there's a bed that had been kind of grown over with grass, and it just felt like I was like breaking into new ground, even though I'd planted in that bed before, you know, but that newness of Aries, and then stepping back from that bed and looking at it, you know, all primmed up and nice and manicured, all the grass is pulled out, and just like, wow, now there's a whole new area to plant in this year, which is really exciting.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that makes sense on a lot of levels. Of course, just as you mentioned, the newness of Aries, the first sign of the year. Happy spring equinox, everybody. I know it's going to be a week or two after the fact when people listen to this, but, you know, to me, it's still very much relevant to talk about it, clearly.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so the newness of Aries comes into play on a number of levels, right? Even Aries corresponds with like childhood and things like that, right? And then, of course, we're going to be getting into lamb symbolism and things like that, and even the idea of the sacrificial lamb, and sort of the concept that the purer the sacrifice, the more potent the sacrifice, basically, the more powerful it is. And so there's a number of myths, especially in the Abrahamic religions, you know, that relates to that. But the thing I think of too is the energy of Mars. And clearly most people, when they think of Aries and Mars, they think of war, right? So it's the planet of war. Obviously, I think about that as well. But there's a whole other aspect to Mars, in my opinion, that does have to do with breaking new ground, as you're saying. So the Mars energy to me is both seen when things are growing and sprouting, when there is this new growth or newness, right? But also, too, when things are breaking down. And this is more so seen in like Scorpio, right? And the traditional ruler of Scorpio being Mars. So I think the energy of things kind of coming forth, right? Almost like wand symbolism. I just did a post on the wand symbolically, right? The wand generally represents like energy being sent forth. I think Mars has a part to play in that, but then also Mars and its driving sort of power also, you know, relates to, as you were saying, like digging into the earth, which phallic symbolism relates to that as well, right?
Yeah.
Planting a seed. There's a sexual dynamic with that, putting a seed into the ground, right? Even, you know, obviously with sex and reproduction and everything else, the symbolism is also there too. Mm-hmm. So I think what you're saying is definitely appropriate.
Yeah, it felt that way when I was out there, you know, and the cool thing I always like about that digging in to reveal, you're revealing something underneath the grass or underneath the ground that maybe hasn't been worked in a little while. And I always feel like when I'm doing that, it's like I'm doing it physically, but I'm also doing it like spiritually with my own psyche or something like that. Because I'm always like thinking about when you're like digging into the ground and like breaking this ground up and kind of like getting down to the roots of what might be there. There's this very healing thing that happens, and I think that's one of the reasons why I like doing it so much, is because I think gardening in general is healing, but there's something about that breaking of the new ground or kind of the mystery of what's under there. You don't know what you're going to find, and so there's that newness is just really refreshing.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you've always loved this too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not like a new thing or whatever, but I have noticed, as I get further and further in my gardening journey, that is one of my favorite parts or favorite things to do, or like making a brand new plot where you look at just a thing of grass. And my mind a lot of times will go to, oh my gosh, I could square this off and I could dig into all that grass and just, pull up the dirt and, because you can essentially make a garden almost anywhere if you have space,
right,
depending on what's going on. So yeah, it's fun.
Definitely. And you're an earth sign, you're a Capricorn.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it kind of plays into that a bit as well, right?
Yeah.
I was going to say the other thing about sort of the sexual dynamic of Mars and sort of that phallic energy, right? A ram caught in a thicket was an old euphemism for sex.
Ah.
So even just the ram itself, it's like they butt heads for mating rights. That's the whole entire thing, is that these rams are going at it because they're trying to mate. And if they're unable to be successful in these little battles, then it's not going to happen, basically. So it's clearly like an alpha male sort of thing. But that is like what they are doing. And they'll do it to the point of exhaustion. And I've heard this several times. I tried to get confirmation that this is the case. But I've heard that male rams will also greet each other by kicking each other in the balls.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I think I maybe heard that about the goat too, but there's a whole relationship as well with the goat and the ram. So if people are unfamiliar with this dynamic, I see the goat and the ram kind of being almost at opposite ends of a pole, symbolically. The goat having a huge association with Saturn, clearly having a relationship with winter, being the first sign, Capricorn, the sea goat or the goat being the first sign of winter, and then Aries, the ram, being the first sign of spring. And so the way some people have put it, it's almost as though the goat is like the left-hand path symbolically, which obviously makes a lot of sense when you look at goat symbolism and just kind of how they are. That kind of contrasts the ram, right? And the ram being more of the right-hand path. And I think that makes a lot of sense too, because with spring, you really see the sun starting to come back, clearly. It's not the symbolic return of the sun. It isn't. The winter solstice, clearly, like, there's a lot of rituals around the return of the sun because it's starting to come back a bit. And then also the summer solstice, the sun is really vibrant and present, but in actuality, the summer solstice is about the sun starting to go away. Right. And so there's a whole entire interplay there, but clearly the springtime has a major, major correspondence with solar symbolism as well. So again, the goat and the ram kind of on opposite ends of this axis or polarity or whatever. And there's even myths that talk about this, like not mixing the goats and the rams together because they're not going to get along. They see things differently, but there's a lot of commonality too. Just with how they're built, the whole horn dynamic and what the horn symbolizes. The horn is very, very powerful. Horn symbolism, very phallic as well. They're both excellent climbers, things like that.
Yeah,
so,
kings and queens of the mountain.
Yeah,
kind of thing.
Totally,
yeah.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. So, Aries season, I always think of sacrifice as well. There's a huge sacrificial element with the beginning of spring. There's a lot of wars that have started during this time of year. Also, there's a lot of military symbolism that corresponds with Aries and with Mars. So as an example, soldiers march. Literally March comes from Mars. So even the month March. And then also even like it's a Roman thing. There's so much Mars symbolism in ancient Rome. but I believe it was called Campus Martius. Used to be like the military training ground, one of them at least, a big one in ancient Rome, and it basically meant the field of Mars. You know, there's a lot of things going on like that. There were different assassinations, like Caesar, he was assassinated during this time of year. Christ, there's a huge Jesus Christ correspondence with the ram, with the lamb, with Aries season being sacrificed, being crucified right at sort of the equinox time, and then coming back as well, his resurrection, and then him being the sacrificial lamb. There's a lot of sacrificial symbolism with this time of year, and the way I kind of put it is it almost seems as though there's this dynamic where the first thing in a system or in a cycle almost needs to be sacrificed in order to kickstart the cycle, in order for it to kind of move along there. So there's this idea of the first fruit or the firstborn as well, which there's multiple myths about this, but the sacrifice of the firstborn son being offered up for this sort of ritual or what have you, you know, to these gods and whatnot. And so there's a whole entire thing baked into almost every aspect of Aries symbolism that relates to that. And so even my poster that I illustrated really plays into this as well, this idea of sacrifice and whatnot. But to me, it just makes a lot of sense that this would actually sort of be the case. And one of the things I'll say that it kind of relates to is that when we go through these different ages, what's been commonly said about like the age of Aries in this instance is that when we go through these different ages, an animal that corresponds with that age will be revered, and then once that age passes, then that animal becomes a sacrificial sort of thing. And so with the age of Taurus, the cow, the bull, honored, revered, and then once it passed, it became sacrificial. Same thing with Aries. That almost like the sacrifice of the ram symbolically is almost like the end of the age of Aries.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So the Mars thing clearly plays into that as well, right? We talked about it last time, I think, briefly, but like the soil wanting blood and nutrients and whatnot as well, right?
Mm-hmm. And, you know, one of the things that I thought of with the sacrificial element of Aries when I was preparing for this is from a gardening perspective or a plant perspective. Typically, you know, like you're going to plant seeds, you know, early in the season. Some of those seeds become sacrifices because they're sacrificed to the weather. They might be sacrificed to the birds and other animals that might come and eat them. So it's almost kind of like when you're laying down the first seeds of the season, you almost have to lay them down with the mentality of they might not come up. And I think you should do that with all the plants that you plant so that you don't have like an expectation. You don't get let down when something doesn't go the way you thought it would go. But same thing even with like plants that you start. You might have plants that are young and it was time to get them into the ground. You may get a late snow that comes through or a late frost that you weren't expecting. Those plants may have been the sacrifice that was needed to be made in that season of growing, you know? And so it's just one of the things that kind of came to my mind when I thought of this about the sacrifice and this time of year, because everything too in the gardening aspect in this time is usually really fragile and young. You're dealing with babies.
Yeah.
Every time I look at the sprouts that, you know, I start and they're in the garden shed and they're just these tiny little babies. They're so young and fragile and they're not used to the elements yet. You're going to have to train them, you know, harden them off, put them into the elements a little bit and then take them back to shelter and things like that. And so there's just always room for sacrifice, or there's always something that might come through. And
right. And how common is a sacrificial offering sort of mention in rituals?
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so this is a common thing. So sacrifice or offering or exchange, there's a lot of overlap there, actually, right? And so whether you're offering up something that doesn't necessarily need to die, something, you know, it's not necessarily living, but you're offering up something for your ancestors or whoever you might be working with, something along those lines, right? This is a very, very common sort of thing. And one of the things it reminds me of a little bit is just the nature of fire, which we're dealing with a cardinal fire sign, right? And so when we're dealing with fire in the tarot, we're talking about the wands. Well, what is a wand? In the tarot, it can be anything from a deliberate wand that was crafted and, turned into something that looks, polished and refined and everything else, or it could just be something as simple as a stick or a branch, right? And so at the end of the day, though, it's wood. Part of the nature of the wand is literally the fact that it is made out of wood, and that is the main component of most fires, would be something made out of wood, right? Mm-hmm. And so a fire can't burn or thrive without a quote unquote sacrifice, without some sort of exchange. And so the wand, therefore, is essentially kind of a storage of energy, right? And so there's a whole dynamic there with even what wand symbolism represents in the tarot as well, because I see it a lot of times as it represents this dynamic of an exchange or of a sacrifice. If you want your project to work and take off, you might have to sacrifice something, meaning like your time, meaning like free time,
right?
And your ability to do other things. You might want to go on vacation. You might want to do this and that and the other thing. You might want to just relax, but that's not going to get this project done. And so going to work, clearly who wouldn't want to just relax and spend time with their family or children or whatever it is? But instead, they know that this is a sacrifice they have to make. So there's actually a huge thing with wand symbolism as well that I see that's related to like duty and service and responsibility as well, right?
Yeah.
And so when I say sacrifice, I don't necessarily mean it in this like dark sort of way, right? I think that every single time you do anything, you're kind of sacrificing everything else you could be doing to make that one thing sort of work. Yeah. So just a few thoughts off the top of my head regarding Aries, but I'm pretty excited today because we have a handful of voicemails that we're going to play on the show. And I asked a couple of people to submit very special voicemails regarding Aries symbolism. And then I also have a handful of random voicemails from people who submitted them online. So this is the first time we're opening this up. And I think this is going to be a really, really good sort of segment here. And I think there's going to be a lot to talk about once we listen to everything.
I agree. I have been thinking about it all day today before we sat down to record, because I really love the idea of opening up the phone line, sort of say. It's almost like a callback to like the old radio shows where you could call in and you could, talk to the hosts and stuff like that. And as we said in the first episode, your audience typically has a lot of really great insights that they share in like your comment sections and everything. So this was our way of kind of trying to open up the floor for them. So thanks to everybody that took some time to submit your thoughts, and let us play them here and then riff on what you guys had to say.
Yeah, definitely. And so I'll just say right now too, if there's a sign that you're interested in submitting a voicemail for, just keep it in mind, because this is going to be an open sort of forum that way through the year, right? And we're planning on covering all of the signs, and I know that I definitely have a unique relationship with some signs, as does everybody. And so if you don't have anything to say with, say, Aries or Taurus, but you have a lot to say with Gemini or Cancer, wait until that time and maybe start writing, what you really want to say. At least right now, we're giving people a couple of minutes to talk about whatever they want to talk about as it relates to the symbolism of the sign. And then the people that I requested a recording from, we gave them 5 minutes.
Yes.
And so this is all subject to change.
Right.
But I think this is going to be a great time. So is there anything about Aries that you wanted to get off your chest before we start playing voicemails, or anything that you just wanted to bring up and riff on for a few before we get to that? Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying our discussion on Aries symbolism. If you aren't already aware, I have a series called Symbolic Secrets that's only available through my site or through Patreon. At the moment, I'm releasing one episode for every major arcana card and have released 12 so far. That's 12 hours worth of exclusive content. Links for everything can be found at symbolicstudies.com. This is also the perfect way to support the show if you like what you're hearing. And with that said, back to the episode.
I do have a few plants that I think would be great to talk about. They're not necessarily ruled by Aries, and I tend to like to look at these correspondences in the way of what do I think is an herb that would be good for some of the qualities that might come through for Aries or with Aries. So, for example, one of the plants that I have is dandelion. Most people are very familiar with dandelions. They come up, they're starting to come up during this time. They're one of the first flowers of the spring. And a lot of times they're used during this time for detox because they're going to help us flush things out that we were storing throughout the winter. And one of the cool things about dandelion is that it does have the yellow flower, and some of the colors that are associated with Aries are orange, red, and yellow. And when I think of yellow, and when I was doing this weave, I think of bile, because I like to think of the body systems, how our bodies react, and plants. That's usually my filter, right? And so with dandelion, it is known to be a liver supportive plant. And the liver and the gallbladder are both responsible for either bile production or the storage of bile. And bile is yellow. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting, I just finished reading the book Real Alchemy by Robert Allen Bartlett, who is an alchemist up in Washington State. And he has a chart in there and talks about Mars being related to the gallbladder, which I thought was really interesting because of that bile connection. Also, the gallbladder is typically linked to our ego and our will. And sometimes the emotions that come along with like jealousy and condemning things or anger. Anger is a lot of times related to the liver, but these organs work very, very closely with each other. So I wanted to bring dandelion to the surface because I think it's a good plant for this time of year because it stimulates the digestion, it promotes detoxification, and it's very bitter. And so those bitter herbs are really great for just like being astringent and stimulating these systems that are going to help with the bile production. And another thing, too, that's interesting about gallbladder that I know is that a lot of times when you have a gallbladder ailment, sometimes it'll manifest as what they'll call a gallbladder headache, which I think is interesting for Aries because Aries is the head.
Oh, yeah.
And so what happens with the gallbladder, the meridian of the gallbladder, now this is more the Chinese medicine route, but that meridian will come up the right side, even sometimes into the right shoulder, like underneath the shoulder, up the neck, and it can kind of come up the head. And the headaches will usually start like in the temples, and it sometimes will kind of come and be in your eyes. It's very strange. I've had this before because the gallbladder is an area where I've had to pay attention to in my own life. And so you'll feel like almost like a headache that's like in your eye. It's really interesting. It kind of like comes over the top of your head and will like settle in one of your eyes. And that to me was something I definitely wanted to bring up because of that Aries head connection as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff there to talk about. Yeah, the head connection, it makes so much sense that Aries would be related to the head and this sort of headstrong nature, leading the way. I think maybe last time I said it too, but the head is known for leading the way. The feet are kind of symbolically known for trailing behind, right? Almost like a tail or something like that, right? And so this relates to some of the sexual symbolism that I was alluding to earlier, the head,
right?
The penis has a head,
right?
And so it's what breaks, new ground symbolically, right? When you're driving something into the ground or what have you. Even the battering ram, they used to make battering rams with ram heads on it. And so the battering ram, I made a video, right, where I put an image in there that's like that. It's this Roman battering ram, and it has this really cool looking ram head at the very end of it that they use to obviously, destroy doors and get into, a place and everything else. Dandelion too, just have to say dandelion, right? So we're dealing with the lion. So another fire sign. So that's interesting. And then the yellow thing, I think it's kind of cool that you bring this up because I was reminded of the fact that the card that corresponds with Aries is the Emperor card, right? I've been talking about that. And there is a huge connection with some of these cards literally embedding the glyph of sulfur into the artwork of the card, specifically the Thoth deck. That's like a known sort of thing where the glyph of sulfur is encoded into the artwork, and it's written about. The official book, the Book of Thoth, discusses this and everything else. And so sulfur is in play right now. And so I actually pulled out a little jar of sulfur that we have around because it's one of the philosophical elements, and there's a huge relationship with what the Emperor means, once again ruled by Aries, and all of that, and it's very yellow.
It is, yes.
And sulfur being like a really, really important element, right? And so the three philosophical elements, for people who don't know, it would be sulfur, salt, and mercury. So sulfur would be the fiery, active sort of component there. And most people, from what I recall, like the glyph for sulfur is an upward triangle with a cross right underneath. And there's a huge aspect too with the Emperor related to crosses. It's the fourth card of the Major Arcana. I did a presentation last year called Kingdoms, Kings, and Crosses. And I talk about this epic weave between kingdoms being quartered, having sort of a central sacred center location, and then kings wanting to rule from this sacred center. Kings oftentimes being related to the cross. Once again, Christ, the symbolic mythological King of Kings in Christianity, being crucified. And so there's a whole gigantic aspect here between all of these different things and the cross. So it would make sense that the glyph for sulfur would have a cross on it as well. But yeah, that's a great weave with the gallbladder and then the headache thing. That's super interesting.
Yeah, it's a really, really cool one. And it's there's so many ways to know, like, to listen to your body. And once you start mapping your body out in that way and make these kind of connections and see how connected all these things are, like seasonally too, it becomes mind-blowing. And it's very empowering as well, because it is always that reminder that we can tap into nature and astrology and the plants around us and food during different seasons for different things that we're meant to be working on. And before we move on from the sulfur weave, one of the things that came through when you said sulfur, speaking of plants and vegetables, I thought of garlic, which typically corresponds to Mars. For sure, with that fiery nature. Talk about moving fluids, and it can thin the blood. It can even, I mean, we have both experienced it, but like you can kind of, if you take garlic when you're feeling under the weather or something, you take like fresh garlic cloves, you can sometimes get like a euphoric or like a garlic high almost from it. It goes right to your head.
Oh, yeah.
And so it can become like almost disorienting, or you kind of feel lifted or lightheaded a bit. The other thing that comes to mind is cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, all have sort of like a sulfuric scent to them. So like if you ever have driven through an area where there's cabbage fields, it sometimes smells like sulfur. It's the cabbage, it's that scent of the sulfur. And I can't not bring up DMSO when I think of sulfur, and also fire and the fiery energy that DMSO brings. And, that's another thing. And DMSO, that can be a whole different rabbit hole. But the other thing that comes to mind is MSM sulfur, which is the cousin to DMSO. And working with these two things specifically for a handful of years, I've noted and experienced how deeply healing they are to our systems and how essential they are in a first aid kit. And so again, back to the importance of sulfur and how much it really means. It's a really important element in our lives.
Right. And as you mentioned, DMSO is a huge weave, and we could talk about it, especially you obviously can talk about it at length and its importance and all of that. But just one thing I want to mention symbolically, DMSO is known for being a driver.
Yes.
And so we were talking about this earlier with the dirt and Mars. And so there's a penetrative quality there.
Yes.
There's a penetrative quality to the head and the ram and things like that. And also for this reason, I think it's really interesting that Aries corresponds with Mars. The traditional correspondence for Scorpio is also Mars. And there's a major penetrative weave with Scorpio, especially the stinger of Scorpio, right?
Right.
And so DMSO kind of plays into all of that, I would say.
It definitely does. And for people who aren't familiar, DMSO is dimethyl sulfoxide. That's the chemical name of it, but it is shortened to DMSO.
Right, right. Excellent. And then also garlic. Yeah, that's a huge one. That's great.
Yeah, big time.
That makes perfect sense.
It makes so much sense. It's one of the first things I do think of when I think of like Aries, Mars, Martian planets or whatever is garlic. And it's just so wonderful and has so many health benefits.
Martian plants.
Martian plants. Sorry, not Martian planets.
Yeah. No, you got it. We are talking about
plants,
Mars,
planets,
the planet. Yeah. Well, isn't that interesting? There is a weave between a plant and a planet.
Oh, yes.
And it's just a separation of an E in between the N and the T, but that's neither here nor there. Perhaps a conversation for another time. Also, the word plane relates to this as well. Plane, planet, plant. But let's do this. Let's get to the first voicemail and let's talk about what they have to say. So what we're going to do is we're going to play the voicemails and we're going to wait to comment on each one after the fact. And we're just going to give them the space to say what they want to say. This first one is going to be great. I have full faith. I have not listened to this one yet. So this is from our buddy Chance over at the Interverse podcast. You've been on Chance's podcast multiple times, as have I. He was one of the first podcasts I ever did when I first started becoming public with symbolism stuff. And he's a wealth of knowledge, and he's also an Aries.
Yes.
And so I thought he was the perfect person to reach out to for this one. He was excited to do it. And so this one clocks in just under 6 minutes. So I'm going to hit play here. We're going to listen to Chance talk about Aries symbolism from his perspective, and then we'll comment.
Yes, sounds great.
Hey, y'all. This is Chance from the Interverse podcast. I absolutely love Mario and Michelle. And I want to give them big ups for this series and a big thanks for asking me to contribute a little something. So when we talk about Aries, most people are very focused on the Martian qualities, the warrior, the anger, the impulsiveness, and the impatient aspects. This is all there, but what is usually left out of the conversation is the quality of innocence and purity. These probably seem like conflicting traits, and I love a good paradox, so let's dig in. When you think about the zodiac as a representation of the cycle of life, Aries would represent birth, the beginning. At this point of the year, I always feel a huge surge of inspiration to do more and do better. It's unfortunate that people put their New Year's resolutions in January, where the energy of the world is more frozen. I think they do a lot better to set those goals around the spring equinox. So if Aries is the baby of the zodiac, innocence makes sense. I find it interesting that the system of human design, which blends astrology with the I Ching, associates hexagram 25, innocence, with Aries. The trigrams of number 25 are the creative above the arousing, which are correlated in physiology to the head and the feet, respectively. In other words, Aries and Pisces. So the spring equinox, where we transition from Pisces to Aries, is indicated with this hexagram. The summary of this energy is our power and inspiration being supported by a shock, a disturbance, or impulse. This is kind of like the baby who is in a constant state of awe, sometimes being disturbed, even by their own impulses, like my 5-month-old daughter who is figuring out her body right now and sometimes scratches or punches herself, and is as quick to laughter as to crying. A trusting nature is also a part of Aries. Biblically, the story of the binding of Isaac represents this quality perfectly, as Isaac has perfect innocent trust for Abraham, despite being almost sacrificed by him. The last-minute replacement of a ram to be sacrificed demonstrates the astrotheology of Aries in this Genesis story. In Taoism, the masters say, if you don't know what cannot be done, you will accomplish great things. Those who know no limits meet with no obstruction. What they mean by this is that the state of innocence ensures your success because our self-imposed limits and fear of failure stop us from acting. Yet it is stasis that is the only failure, because all mistakes can be corrected. but they have to be made before we can grow. The pure warrior embodies innocence by having no doubts. My personal Aries mindset is, I have a vision of absolute victory. Defeat has no place in my mind. With the head symbolism of Aries, we should also consider wisdom. Pure wisdom is childlike and simple. Interestingly, in Hebrew, there are two words that mean both head and also chief or lord. The first is Ras, spelled Resh, Aleph, Shin. Ras in many languages also means wisdom, similar to the Greek word archi, which means head, chief, or wisdom. The book of Genesis begins with Ba Rashit, Bra Aliem, Ath Eshmaim, Uath Earts, which, instead of in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, could be better translated as by wisdom, or through the head, the goddesses formed the heavens and earth. With a little priestly wordplay, we find Aries here, because the second Hebrew word that means head, chief, or lord, which is Ayl, or Aleph Yod Lamed, well, this word also means ram, a male sheep. We know that wordplay and puns are important tools of esotericism, and so in Genesis 1:1, the esoteric take is that Aries is encoded as the beginning of the story through the word Ras in Barashit, as is the Hermetic axiom of mentalism, that the cosmos is mental in nature, as the formation of all things came through the head of the divine beings, which is where we experience wisdom. Lastly, I think it's interesting that the two sacrificial animals of the zodiac, the lamb and the goat, occur at the winter solstice and the spring equinox, respectively. The innocence of the lamb's sacrifice represents the return of the world to a pure state in springtime, where life is fresh and uncorrupted, whereas the scapegoat of Capricorn occurs when the sun is at its lowest point and corruption or death is about to follow. So I hope this gives you guys something new to think about with Aries, and maybe causes you to look at Aries people in your life a little differently. I may be a bit more on the innocent side myself since I'm a 322 Aries at the cusp with Pisces, a fresh baby, if you will. And maybe those April Aries are a bit more hot-headed. But I think any Aries sun who is in alignment with their true self, temper and all, has pure intentions, even when aggressive. So stay patient with these guys, as they're doing their best to be patient too. They're just so stoked they can't help it. Thanks, Mario and Michelle, and everybody listening. And I encourage you to keep that childlike wonder, innocence, and trust for life alive and well this spring, everyone. Much love, everybody.
All right, our first voicemail has been played. Chance, thank you so much, man. That was really awesome. I got a lot out of that. And once again, I think he was the perfect person to submit something here. There's a lot to talk about there. He jammed in a lot of information, which is always cool.
Yeah, he's super pro.
Oh, yeah.
Chance is a pro. He's awesome.
Yeah, absolute pro through and through. So the Binding of Isaac story is in my notes as well to discuss. The fact that Isaac was replaced with a ram to sacrifice. This is really interesting as well because there's a Greek correspondence with this, and it's with the winged mythical golden ram, basically, which is where the golden fleece comes from. And it was the same storyline, essentially, that there was a firstborn son that was going to be sacrificed, and instead he was replaced with the ram. So isn't that interesting that the ram literally has taken the place of multiple sacrifices, throughout world mythology? So that's interesting. The innocence thing, absolutely. I mean, we were kind of alluding to that earlier with the purity of a lamb and just the whole dynamic of an innocent offering being a more potent offering, right? This is sort of the classic kind of dynamic that's been put out there. I really like what he said regarding pure wisdom being childlike.
Yes.
It reminds me of a few things. And one of them is that I read a book about John Dee, and at least according to this author, he was saying that John Dee went through this huge ritual that took a really long time to complete. At the end of the day, he essentially met God, according to this author, and John Dee was blown away that God was a child. And this is kind of one of the reveals of the whole entire book, that he did not see that coming. And my understanding is that in the Western esoteric world, that this is referred to as the crowned and conquering child, basically. And so I think it's interesting as well that we refer to the sun as a son, as in like a boy, right? A child. And the symbol for the sun, the glyph for the sun, is the circumpunct, which is called the Godhead as well. So even with, solar symbolism being what it is, the fact that we call it the sun kind of plays into some of this, I would say. Those are a few things that I kind of wanted to bring to the table, or those are some of the highlights for me, at least. I love the fact that he brought in the I Ching and things like that too. So I thought it was just obviously excellent overall.
Yeah, and I would second many of the things you said, especially the innocence point that he made. And I really like that he brought that other perspective of, the Aries being excitable as well, and like that they're just kind of so pumped about something that sometimes it can come off as overpowering or overbearing or something like that, but it's like literally just their excitement for life or a subject or whatever, which also reminds me of the springtime. Think of how exciting it is for a plant to be popping up after a long winter, all that potential that's there. I like that he brought that into the fold too, of setting your intentions during this time. I think that is a really great idea. And just like there is so much potential stored up that it does feel like a new beginning or a fresh start.
Right. Absolutely. All right. So for the next voicemail, we have our friend Joshua the Branch. And Joshua is a really interesting guy. I always appreciate his insights. And you've had him on your show.
Yes.
And so we talked about the plants of the Bible, right? And so that's one of the shows we've done together. But I've talked to him, multiple times throughout the years. And I thought it was interesting as well that I reached out to him and he said, oh, well, I'm actually an Aries. I thought, I'm like, you're like the perfect person to talk about some of this stuff. And I would love for you to submit something. And he was like, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. And so here we're going to play his recordings. He has one that's about 8 minutes long, and then he has a little follow-up recording with some additional thoughts. And so we're going to play those, and then we will discuss.
Hey, Mario and Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. Thanks for this opportunity to share about the Ram and Aries. I wanted to first take a look at the Hebrew spelling of Ram, Resh, Aleph, Mem. Resh, referring to the head or beginning of the year. The ecclesiastical year would begin around this time with the first light after the new moon following the spring equinox. So the time we're in now precisely matches up with about that time. And so Resh is the beginning or the head of the year, referring also to the authority or leadership associated with the priesthood. And also this is the space in which when mapping the zodiac to the body, Resh is also where memory resides, the RAM of our body, random access memory. So we go next to Aleph, representing unity, divinity, the sacrificial oxen, lambs, goats, bulls, doves, could all perhaps fall into the category of Aleph, being divine oxen. Are associated too with the sacrificial fires within the temple. Not your typical fire, but a sacrificial fire, one that burns intensely, where it consumes wholly. There's nothing meant to be left. And sometimes too the ash would be gathered from these creatures and used in purification rituals. So it was thought that this did in fact connect to divinity. Also the spoken word and refers to the throat here, because Aleph will match up with the throat. And so the mouth and the throat will relate to these spoken decrees that are first formed in the mind of God, right? The Resh. And so the Mem then is that everything that is spoken is written down, and that the stories and scriptures too connect us to this past, the past exploits and the words that are formed, etc. For they are all meant to connect us back to a memory of a time when we were visited by God or given assistance. And so also with Mem we have memory, wisdom, life, waters, people, So when we think of our blood and what we all share in our bodies, that is the mem, or collective memory, or the genetic memory comes to mind, right? The blood is also formed in the bones, which is a Saturnian element. So we can see the Saturnian and Mars connection here with this type of thing, because the laws, very Saturnian, the exception made to the laws through the blood, that is where Mars kind of comes into this. And we also got judgment on the flip side when the fall festivals come around. And so we see how Mars governs both the spring and fall equinoxes, which we have ox in that name with the aleph emphasis. So we have the sacrificial animals being provided at those times during the equinoxes, right? So I like to call them the equinoxen. And so the Egyptian traditions also have a cosmogony or theogony with the Ramua of the flood, begetter of the ram in the pool. And so we have this representation of a ram standing on the first mound of earth, that which was the altar to creation. And so this sacrifice formed the foundation for all of creation that would take place afterward, referring to the blueprint in the mind of God, the thoughts that were first formed before the spoken decrees or even emanated from the mouth of God, right? So, and I'll finish by explaining how this connects back to what Christ is referring to. So in Isaiah 28:16, it's referring to a future prophecy about, "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation." Foundation relates to Yesod and the Separat. We know too that David was a military leader, and he wanted to house the Ark of the Covenant in a temple, but was only permitted to form the foundation. So there again, we see a relationship there. And so we learn a little bit more about Passover and the ritual in Exodus 12, verses 3 through 14, where we read about the Passover lamb, whose bones cannot be broken. So again, a big emphasis on the bones, Saturnian law, and the blood and of the lamb. So that is preserved in that ritual. Then in Luke 22:19, Christ refers to his body as the bread, which would not be leavened, by the way, because it's Passover. So that is a memorial of the time that they were led out of Egypt, out of spiritual captivity. And so we are instructed to do this in remembrance, because if we forget God, he'll forget us. That's how the tradition goes, right? So in this case, he says, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Nothing more ram than that. Resh Aleph Mem. Do this in remembrance of me. Eat this lamb and this bread as a Passover meal in remembrance of me and what I did for you, right? So we see the elements of mercy and judgment present here with the ram, for its blood and sacrifice is often a scapegoat for the sin of the people. And so we have the Scorpio Mars vibe on Judgment Day, contrasted to the mercy and exception from wrath in the springtime rituals of Passover. And so we have that contrast between the cardinal fire of Aries, representing the sacrificial fire, and the fixed water pools of the waters that were used in the temple to wash away the blood. We also got the baptismal pool that is used in that way to purify priests and brides and those sorts of things. So I feel that Aries is a very interesting time because it brings in these unique qualia to water and fire as they relate to the temple and the relationship of the priests to the population as a whole, and how they served the population at that time. So thank you again for allowing me the opportunity to do this blurb in remembrance of the majestic ram. My apologies, I forgot to mention one important thing, and that is that referring to the foundation, a lot of times it was customary for a lamb to be buried under the altar of a church. Again, when we see the hypercube unfolded, it makes a cross, right? And there's always that one spot on the cross with a protrusion. I kind of think that's the altar in this case, right? The fifth element aspect that's represented by this lamb under the altar is kind of, in that way, the spirit that's inside of the tetragrammaton, so to speak. But this would be called a grim kirk, and so it was thought that then the spirit of that animal would then haunt the church or the grounds. And so in a manner of speaking, I think that could be how the Holy Ghost is kind of explained, in a sense, is that the crucifixion of the blood, the crucifixion rather of the Lamb of God resulted in a Grimkirk phenomena where the Holy Ghost now haunts the earth. And so I just wanted to mention that as a final thought. Thank you so much.
All right, Joshua the Branch coming through with some interesting insights. And of course, I knew he would bring a biblical perspective, and I requested that from him because that's what I appreciate about him, amongst other things.
Yes.
You know, so that was great. And there's a few things that I do want to comment on. Equinox, bringing up ox being related to this. He was mentioning the aleph and that meaning ox, and that's the first Hebrew letter. I had never considered that, the equinox, but now I probably won't forget that. The equinoxen is what he said. That's pretty fun. You know, there's been mention of blood several times today already. Obviously, it makes tons of sense with the sacrificial nature of things. And I just wanted to bring up the fact that I think it's so fascinating that men have more iron in their blood than women. Mm-hmm. And iron corresponds with Mars, right? That's the metal correspondence for Mars. And as it's been said, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. I think there's an esoteric angle to this as well. But if we take that sort of at face value, men having more iron being related to Mars, and women having more copper in their blood, which relates to Venus.
Right.
Right. So I think that is really intriguing. So I had to bring that up. Regarding the stone, he brought up stone symbolism a little bit, and this foundation concept, and it just reminds me of the fact as well that the Emperor card, the Emperor in the Rider-Waite version at least, he's in between two mountains, and what I've put forward is that he is symbolically the central mountain, and so he's like the central stone essentially, right? And so he's almost like this magnetic stone at the north, I would say, and it's not uncommon for him to actually be sitting on a cubic stone. This is a theme in the tarot with the Emperor card. Sometimes he's not sitting on a literal throne. He is sitting on a cubic stone. And that cubic stone, as he mentioned, the stone, or the cube rather, unfolds into a cross.
Right.
Right. And so that's really intriguing. And then him talking about the ram being buried underneath a church, I think that's very interesting. He also mentioned that being sort of like the point, the fifth point, it being symbolic of ether or spirit, the fifth element. Well, when you're looking at the cross, the point in the middle where the vertical line and the horizontal line intersect, that would be the fifth point. That's like the sacred center of the cross. And so to me, cross symbolism relates to crossing over as well. That point in the middle is the transcendental point in that little system, right? So the cross relates to the four because you have four quadrants, four lines emanating from the center, but it also has this hidden relationship with the number 5. And then the fifth point would be right there, dead center in the middle of the cross. So those are some of the things I want to say. So Joshua, thank you so much for bringing that up. Did you have anything you wanted to mention?
Yeah. Excellent contribution Josh, this was great. And you did bring up something that reminded me of something else that I was going to bring to the table today for Aries, which is the memory aspect. And you used the word remembrance. And one of the plants that I brought in my notes was rosemary, because rosemary is really wonderful for memory and sometimes is known, you might hear the phrase rosemary for remembrance. And that I feel as though it's Shakespearean, but I know that I've heard it from Susan Weed. That's where I first heard it, but I think there might be a Shakespeare connection to the rosemary for remembrance. It is one of the most wonderful plants for memory, brain, and stimulating blood flow to the brain. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring that up and bring it to the table, because of that connection to the head. And there's a fiery element to rosemary. There's also a bitter element to rosemary. So it's tightening and astringent. It is a herb for the hair and for the scalp, another connection to the head. So thank you for bringing the remembrance, because it made me remember the connection to rosemary. And then his point about the sacrificial fire, burning things beyond recognition. So like burning something and leaving no trace, which made me think of something else that I had written down in my notes, which is something I just recently learned again in the Real Alchemy book by Robert Bartlett about the secret fire in alchemy. And so the secret fire is also equated to a special menstruum. And a menstruum is basically a solution that you will be soaking a plant in or some sort of organic material in to make a medicine. But the secret fire provokes dissolution and separation. And so it's called the secret fire because it's doing this separation or this dissolution without external fire, if that makes sense. So there's not a flame, but the fire is actually the alcohol or the vinegar or the ether or the acetone that you're going to be using to dissolve whatever it is that you're working with. And so that's a little bit of more recent knowledge that I've acquired, but it did make me think about Aries and just the element of fire. And so
Nice.
that's what I wanted to add to his voicemail.
Excellent. Thank you. That's really cool. So much love and respect to Chance and Joshua. They came through, and I am really looking forward to having more sort of personal invites, basically, to the channel. And I have a lot of people sort of lined up in my mind that I'm going to reach out to and see if they want to contribute something. And I'm sure you'll hear these voices again as well, in this podcast, because both of them are really just a wealth of knowledge. All right, so moving on, let's get to some of the submissions that I got on my website, through email, etc. So for the first one we have today, we have Sandy the Sandwoman.
Ooh.
And she has a contribution that's a little under 2 minutes here.
All right.
Hi, Symbolic Studies. The observation I have about Aries might be a little bit shocking, but here it goes. So, Aries usually get a bad rap for being bullheaded and aggressive, but I don't think it's true. Even though Aries often gets compared to Taurus, and I'll explain why by using the symbols for both Aries and Taurus. If you look at the symbol for Taurus, at the part which symbolizes the horns, if you draw a line from the right one and the left one, the lines are straight and they extend to infinity and they never meet. However, for the symbol of Aries, if you go to the horn bits and you draw a line from the left and from the right, you get an almost heart-shaped symbol. And if you look at the bigger picture, the symbol of Aries resembles a sprout, which, since it's the first sign and it's in spring, it kind of makes sense. And I don't know if anybody spoke about this, but it's just something that I've noticed.
Thank you, Sandy, for the contribution. And absolutely, I see your point loud and clear. We were actually just talking about this sort of the heart connection with the Aries glyph. And all you have to do is just imagine the symbol for the heart or draw it yourself, and you can see the Aries dynamic embedded in there. And I see that there is a toroidal connection with the heart, and I see there's a toroidal connection with the Aries glyph. And I probably mentioned it last time, but the Pisces glyph looks like it's the cross section of the Taurus field as well. And so I see that for sure. And I think that with all of the talk today regarding blood, that makes even more sense, that it would be connected to the heart. Also, because Christ has been brought up several times, but I'm thinking of Christ's flaming heart as well. That's a common motif associated with him touching his heart like that. So I think that's all well taken. Do you have any thoughts about this one?
Yeah, definitely. This is one of my favorite things about the Aries glyph and the connection to the heart. And what it makes me think of is the infinite potential, kind of like what Chance had brought up about, just the potential of this time and making your intentions now, because we a lot of times we do feel a sense of renewal when it comes to this time of year. After a long winter, the sun is back, the air is fresher, there's more movement and things like that. So that toroidal motion of just everything emanating from that one point but returning to that point, and how important that is, and how important it is also when it comes to what you talk a lot about, babe, with our sacred center and finding our center, knowing our center, and how important it is to be able to come to our own center and stand strong in that center. And when you are feeling out of sorts, how grounding it can be when you do take that moment to recenter and remember that you have your center and it's there for you in a time where you need stability. And I think that the heart and the Taurus field and even the Aries glyph shows that sort of energy there too, that central point or the sacred center. It emanates, it's emanating from that one place.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So I would even say too, regarding the heart, like the symbol for the heart, the common symbol for the heart, what I see in that, I see a very similar thing with the Aries glyph. So if you imagine drawing the Aries glyph from the bottom point, and then it's kind of sprouts upward and splits, right? Mm-hmm. It's like the monad splitting from itself. It's the one splitting from itself, but then also returning back to itself.
Right.
And that completes the heart, right? And so that completes the heart glyph. So imagine just that central point splitting from itself, working its way down, but then also reuniting, right? And there's a lot of symbolism related to love and sort of twin flame symbolism, if you want to put it that way. I think there's a lot of kind of funny stuff going on in that world, but a lot of it has to do with a reunification, right? And I think a lot of this is actually baked into Gemini symbolism, and Gemini corresponds with the Lover's card, right? And so this idea of separation from the one and then reunifying with it is a big aspect here, in my opinion. So excellent stuff. For
yeah,
sure.
This is great points.
Awesome. All right. So the next one here is from Jordan Fishman.
Okay. So obviously, Aries connected to Mars, its ruler, Mars being the god of war. So, connected to martial, but also for some reason, Mar is the word for sea. Um, and that connection to what is naval or the navy, connecting, warriors of the sea, but also nave all the word itself. It's like the nave of God, the womb of God, the source of God, the wet source of God for some reason. But in a sense, that which is connected to Mars is also, Aries being Aryan, and that which, these cultures that wanted to just connect themselves to that which is Aryan. But the word Aryan also derives perhaps from when Atlantis sunk and rose up as three islands, or was destroyed the first time, I think, according to Casey's readings, Edward Casey's readings. It returned as Pisidia, and Aryan, and all these cultures from the Nazis to the Jews wanting to connect themselves to Aryans. Aries being the Lamb of God, Moses being the Ram of God, uh, Jesus being the sacrificial lamb, but also the shepherd of God, the shepherd of the Lord. So there is this liminal space between Pisces and Aries, that which, I guess emerges from the sea to fight, but also lots of cutting references. Jews get circumcised, C sections, um, the spark of life, and how the spark just seems to emerge from, that which is cut, the first primordial scission, let's say. So there's just constant reference to cutting, constant reference to the sea, and constant reference to war, and somehow life emerges from all of it.
Excellent. Thank you, Jordan. That was great. There's a few things that he mentioned that could be really expanded upon. And I think I'll introduce a couple of these topics. Maybe we'll, explore these themes briefly, and then we can get onto other voicemails. But there's like a couple things that he mentioned that could be whole shows, like in and of themselves. One would be the Aryan word. What does Aryan actually mean? That's very, very interesting. I'm glad he brought it up because I've thought about this many times, and I know you know this, but one of the interesting sort of images I have in my mind when I went to India was seeing in this one town in particular, a lot of the taxis had a red swastika with the word Aryan right next to it. And I was like, wow, that's really, really interesting. Of all the things, right, this is what I'm seeing here. And I'll just put forward my personal interpretation of what Aryan actually means. In my opinion, Aryan has to do with a northern origin story. And that the people who identify with Aryanism, at the end of the day, the deep, deep esoteric aspect with that word comes from the north. And so there's this old idea that humanity originated from the north, all of humanity originated from the north, and that there was a migration away from the north. And that to be an Aryan is to almost recall that kind of history, right? And so I think that that is sort of the common aspect there. And when you look at words associated with the north, Arctic as an example, Arctos, AR words, there's a number of AR words that go back to the north. And there's a number of UR words that also go back to the north, like Ursa Major, right? And so I think that there's something going on there. The circumcision thing is very interesting as well, because it is related to sacrifice and it's related to some of the themes that we've already brought up. And I will say that I think it's very, very interesting that some of the tools that the Jewish people have created for circumcision, the main implementation that's used looks kind of like an Aries glyph.
Right.
And that's something that I've brought up before. I've shown images of this before. All you have to do, if you're interested in seeing it, Google what those instruments look like, and you will see one that curiously looks very much like an Aries symbol, basically. And so I'm inclined to think that there's something going on there. And then we're dealing with head symbolism, right? And so I think he's absolutely right. I've put that together as well, for sure. So I think some of those comments are spot on.
Yeah, and I really liked his comment about things that are cut, and from those cuts comes life.
Yeah.
Which I think was really interesting. And it makes me even think of, like, going back to the plant world, like clones. Anyone who is familiar with cannabis, but there's other plants too that people will cut and graft and do all things together. But I think of that cut of the main mother plant, and then that becoming the cutting becoming a clone, and then taking cuttings from a plant and either rooting them or just directly planting them. You are basically providing a new life. It's going to branch off and become its own from that main mother plant. And that to me is what came to mind when the cutting, life from cutting.
Right, definitely. That makes sense. Let's move on to Katrina's voicemail. So she left a couple of 1-minute voicemails. Katrina is a very active person in my Telegram, so shout out to her. And she always has excellent insights as well. And she's always sharing very interesting things with me. So let's see what she has to say about Aries symbolism.
Hi, Mario and Michelle. It's Katrina here from Australia. I just wanted to bring up the spiral horns symbolism of the ram, which we do find across both genders, sexes, depending on the breed, obviously. The spiral horn is reminiscent of the double spiral glyph, which we find all over the world and across cultures. And it is found to be amongst the oldest symbols in prehistory as well. The spiral, that alludes to the vortex formations that we find in the subterranean earth energies, as well as in the movement of water, the unfurling of the tendrils of a plant, the double helix structure of DNA molecule in hurricanes, tornadoes, but it's also mirrored in the cosmos in the formation of galaxies. The spiral is often described as well as a symbol of creation in the cycle of birth and death, but also the idea of a path to be climbed. Hi, Mario and Michelle. It's Katrina from Australia. I wanted to bring up the astrological aspects of the Aries archetype, which are often described as, head first, a force to reckon with, very easily to eruptive, almost like a volcano, very destructive. But I think tracking back to the spiral symbolism or the double spiral of their two horns, it's, you've got the spiral of involution and evolution. So there's this, struggle between the forces of creation and the forces of destruction. But we can't have either of them. We can't be without creation or destruction, because energy can neither be destroyed or created. So it's always being recycled.
All right. Thank you, Katrina. I love the fact that she brought up spiral symbolism.
Me too.
Very appropriate. The spiral of life, the curves of life, for sure. And what's interesting to me as well, as it goes back to Mars, Aries being ruled by Mars, and then Scorpio, once again, being the traditional correspondence for it would be Mars, right? The planetary rulership there. And when you look at a scorpion, its tail is very curled. It can be.
Mm-hmm.
And so it reminds me of the same curl that you see in the horns of a ram, right? And so I just think it's really interesting that there's this Martian connection between the ram and then also the scorpion, and then you still have that curve there. And it's interesting that we're talking about the curve because the golden ratio really, of course, comes up. And the golden ratio, the letter that is used to indicate the golden ratio, like in mathematics, I'm pretty sure is phi, right? I think it's really interesting that phi is the beginning of fire as well. And there's a whole entire dynamic with that I've decoded before. But there is a relationship there, and it's called the golden ratio, right? So that's kind of interesting as well. But the golden ratio relates to the 5-pointed star. So literally fire, phi, and 5. The 5-pointed star is basically encoding the golden ratio. And there's a huge relationship with the ratio of the star. And basically, the way I put it is that it seems as though the 5-pointed star is symbolically, and the number 5 as well, exists between the spiritual and the material realm, essentially. I think that's one of the bigger sort of things with the 5-pointed star. So all of those things came to my mind: the golden ratio or the Fibonacci sequence, phi, 5, fire, all of that. But what do you have to say, Bob?
Yeah. Thank you, Katrina. Always bringing it. Yeah, I thought of the same thing. The golden ratio definitely came to mind. So I'm glad you brought that up. Spiral of life came to mind as well. And when I think of the spiral, I think of the wise woman tradition of healing. I also think of the folk tradition of healing. There is more of like a grounded sort of primordial energy that comes from these healing traditions. And that's what I always think of when I think of the spiral. And I think of something that's wholesome and something that is life promoting. It is the opposite of what we kind of get in the Western medical tradition, which is typically more of the suppression, covering things up, not really getting to the root of something. Whereas the spiral is asking you to spiral into something. Like if there is something happening in your body, let's follow the spiral down into where it is so that you can then follow the spiral upward out of the ailment. And so I think that there's just something beautiful when you think of the spiral from a healing aspect, because I think that there's a lot to be learned in that aspect. And it just does, it again reminds me of that potential of Aries, the more positive energy of the potential to heal instead of the opposite of feeling like it's a dead end or there's only one way to heal. The spiral reminds you that along the path of the spiral, there's going to be multiple options that come to you. And so that's something that I definitely thought of. I also thought of the counterclockwise versus clockwise motion, which I'm sure you'd have something to say about that. But spiral of life, all of that is really where my heart went with that one.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, the spiral, for good reason, is one of the most primordial ancient symbols, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, real quick regarding the rotation of a spiral. So if you're following it clockwise, oftentimes a clockwise rotation represents expansion. It's more solar. And then a counterclockwise rotation is more receptive and more polar, I would say, more feminine in nature, right? So that's what I think of. And I think that she brought up an excellent point with the spiral dynamic, that there is both this growth and then also this sort of decay or dissolution aspect with it, right? Mm-hmm. So even someone can spiral out of control.
Right.
And so the death spiral.
Downward spiral.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so it works when it's ascending and also descending, basically, right? And so even the spiral staircase, or just like a, going up or down any system or any sort of ladder or bridge, it's all related to each other. So even I'm thinking of like the Tower card right now. The Tower card corresponds with Mars as well. So here you have this tower that's ascending to the heavens, but now it's being brought down.
Right.
It's kind of like what goes up must come down sort of thing as well, which I think is what she was trying to say in part, right? Just like the nature of life and this experience here. You can't have the good without the bad. You can't have spring without the fall. You can't have summer without winter. You can't have daytime without nighttime, sort of thing. So divine balance, essentially. So excellent stuff. That was a great weave. All right. And for our next voicemail, this submitter calls himself S. And let's see what they have to say.
I love to compare Aries to a dot, like as the sun, like the glyph of the sun that is a dot inside a circle. I really, really think that Aries is the dot. It is like little but very, very, very concentrated, like a lot of power, just concentrated whatever the current moment is happening through that dot. I really, really, really I like to think that Aries for that regard is linked to your attention, because it is something that just keeps going up and keeps changing throughout the day and throughout the time. And you always have like that laser cut type of attention, burning whatever you're seeing with that intensity of being alive, whatever wherever you're seeing and paying attention to, you're, you're like, ah, it is a laser. It is a fucking laser burning whatever you're seeing.
All right, S, thank you for that one. The dot, actually, I mean, it kind of plays into what Katrina said regarding the spiral. The spiral goes on and on and on, but there is an original source for that. And I would say the dot is a good representation of source just in general, the source of all things. So the dot is one of the most epic symbols that you can look into because of its simplicity. It is a seed, it's an egg, it is that point of focus, it's the center, it's the sacred center, it's the middle of a wheel, it's emblematic of even just like a star or a sun. It's in the center of all things, basically. And so with the way I tend to look at things, all things emanate from the center, aka the dot, and everything also returns back to it. So as it relates to the glyph for Aries as well, I think that is what I was referring to earlier with the monad splitting sort of from itself, right? But then with the heart returning back to itself, or like the Taurus field, the dot would be the center of the Taurus field, the point of expression, but then also of return. So I can definitely see what he's saying with all of that stuff. What do you think, Bob?
Yeah, I see this too, and the laser focus or the attention. What that brought to mind is the phrase energy flows where attention goes. So the more you're concentrating on something, obviously, then the more emphasis is going to be put on that thing. So again, always a reminder of what is your focus? Where does your mind go? What are you focused on? Is it productive or not productive? Is it trying to show you something deeper? Are you spiraling your thoughts and it's actually you're putting attention in places that don't really need that energy? It brings up all those kinds of questions, but then there's also the positive flip side of that, of when you have a goal and you are going to put your energy towards that goal, that's where your attention is going. And so the attention and the intention, very similar.
There you go. I love that. That's great. The other thing I'll say too is when it comes to Aries symbolism, again, I brought up the wand earlier. Mm-hmm. I always say this during tarot readings, is that the wand needs a point of focus. The wand needs and requires a target. It needs a goal. It needs aim, right? And it's a very directional tool. So if you're going to watch a movie, as an example, and there's witches and wizards and whatnot, and someone has a magic wand, they're going to point their wand where they want to cast their spell or their intention, basically, right? And so just like the phallus, energy being sent forth, well, where is it being sent to? So in the tarot, I think it's really interesting that there are some cards where all of the wands are pointed in the same direction. And there's other cards where all of the wands are scattered about and they're all pointed all over the place. Well, that's indicative that there is a lack of clarity. There's a lack of focus, right? There's something that is it's not channeled, essentially, right? And so, I think the dot, as it relates to what you're saying, and this focus idea also relates to wand symbolism, basically.
Yeah, I definitely would say that too.
Alrighty, so with all of that said, this concludes our Aries episode.
Yeah, this was awesome with the voicemails. I'm so glad we're moving in this direction.
Oh my gosh. Same here. Yeah, this was a great time. Once again, this is going to be something that we'll be doing moving forward. So if there's a sign that you want to contribute to, you should. And I just really look forward to seeing what else people have to say and who else I touch base with to bring something to the table. So I would say that this was a success. We will see you guys soon for another episode on Taurus.
Woo! Can't wait. Thank you.
All right, guys. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Okay, this concludes the live recording Michelle and I made on Tuesday, March 25th. I really love the fact that we're now playing voicemails. I think it adds a lot of value to the show. Thanks once again to everyone who submitted something, especially Chance from the Interverse podcast and Joshua the Branch. If you want to submit a voicemail for the Symbolism of Taurus episode, you can do so by visiting symbolicstudies.com and click the voicemail button. From there, I give you a few options on how to submit your message. Please keep your recording under 2 minutes in length. Also, in case you weren't aware, I'm available for tarot readings, study sessions, and symbolic birth chart readings. I really love meeting you guys and talking symbolism. Of course, you can book through my site, or as always, you can text me at 503-893-4606 for more information. As always, for exclusive content, head on over to patreon.com/symbolicstudies or symbolicstudies.com/secrets. I've gotten into the routine of posting weekly updates every Friday, and every other week I post something exclusive just for supporters. Without a doubt, this is the best way to keep up with everything I have to offer. And that's going to do it for this episode. We'll see you next month with a show on the symbolism of Taurus. Until then.